He will never notice you. Condemned by her stepmother to live as a mere shadow in her own home, Clara believed the formidable, untouchable Duke of Athelstone would never so much as glance her way. But as she hides in the margins, altering her half-sister's gown for the grand assembly, the secret delivery of a rare botanical sketch reveals a thrilling truth. The coldest man in London has already found the one girl desperately trying to stay hidden. The floors of Vance Manor were made of dark, ancient oak that groaned under the weight of heavy footsteps, yet Clara had long ago mastered the art of walking in absolute silence. She existed in the spaces between the grand furniture, a ghost wearing faded gray muslin, perpetually lingering just outside the golden ring of candlelight. At 22, she had been trained by years of sharp rebukes to make herself smaller, narrower, quieter, until she became little more than an extension of the manor's peeling wallpaper. Visibility, she had learned, was dangerous. It drew the piercing eye of her stepmother, Lady Beatrice, and brought swift, humiliating consequences. So Clara hugged the edges of the corridors, breathing shallowly, asking for nothing. She was the unpaid companion, the seamstress, the invisible foundation upon which the house's social ambitions rested. And tonight, the house was trembling with anticipation for the grandest event of the season. The drawing room smelled sharply of lavender water and tension. Clara knelt on the Aubusson rug, her mouth full of brass pins, her fingers working deftly to alter the hem of a shimmering, rose-colored silk gown. Inside the gown stood Henrietta, Clara's stepsister, sighing impatiently as she stared at her reflection in the towering pier glass. "Careful with the silk, Clara," Henrietta snapped, shifting her weight. "If you pucker the hem, I shall look like a provincial milkmaid, and I cannot afford to look like anything less than perfection. Not tonight." Clara nodded, remaining silent. She removed a pin from her lips and smoothed the fabric, her stitches invisible, perfect. "They say his carriages arrived at Athelstone Park 3 days ago," Henrietta continued, her voice breathy with manic excitement. "4 carriages, Clara, and a dozen outriders. The Duke has not attended a county assembly in half a decade. Do you think the rumors about him are true, that his heart was frozen solid in Russia?" "I do not know the rumors, Henrietta," Clara murmured, her gaze fixed on the delicate rose silk. "Of course you don't. You never know anything of importance." Henrietta preened, adjusting a lock of golden hair. "They call him the Ice Duke, utterly untouchable. But Mother says a man like that, a man with ungodly wealth and no immediate heir, is simply waiting for the right woman to melt his defenses. Someone radiant, someone who belongs at the center of the world." The heavy mahogany doors swung open with a sharp clack. Lady Beatrice swept into the room, her presence instantly lowering the temperature. She was a woman carved from ambition, her posture rigid, her eyes like polished flint. She circled her daughter, inspecting Clara's handiwork with a hawk's scrutiny. "The drape is passable," Beatrice declared, her tone suggesting it was a profound disappointment. She stopped in front of the mirror, her gaze flicking past Henrietta's reflection to land squarely on Clara, who was still kneeling on the floor. Clara had accidentally paused. For a fraction of a second, her eyes had drifted toward the fashion plate resting on the settee, an illustration of an elaborate French gown, but what had caught Clara's eye was the intricate floral embroidery, a cascade of vines she had instantly longed to capture on paper. Beatrice's mouth tightened. "Get up, Clara." Clara quickly placed the pins in their cushion and stood, smoothing her drab gray skirt, her shoulders instinctively curving inward. "Do not look at the fashion plates as though you have any right to such things," Beatrice said, her voice a low, perfectly controlled hiss. She stepped closer, invading Clara's meager space, forcing the younger woman to retreat a half step. "I see the way you watch the door when the invitations arrive. I see the quiet, pathetic little hopes you harbor when you think I am not looking." I harbor no hopes, my lady, Clara said softly, her eyes fixed on the intricate pattern of the rug. Do not lie to me. Beatrice reached out and tipped Clara's chin up with two cold fingers, forcing her to look into her eyes. You think, because you share my late husband's blood, that you are owed a place in the ballroom tonight. You think, perhaps, that if you stand near the pillars in your mended gown, someone of consequence will magically discover you. But let me make this absolutely clear to you, Clara. Beatrice leaned in, every word a calculated strike. You are nothing. You are a shadow in my house. You will stand in the margins tonight, in case Henrietta requires a ribbon tied or a pin replaced, and you will not speak. And as for the Duke of Athelstone, Beatrice let out a short, dry laugh. He is a man who deals in empires and fortunes. Do not dare to dream. He never will notice you. The words settled into Clara's chest like heavy stones. They were not new, but they possessed a fresh, cruel weight. She dropped her gaze, the fight draining out of her. Yes, my lady. I understand. See that you do. Now, fetch the carriage cloaks. We leave in an hour. Clara slipped from the room, her footsteps making no sound on the polished floors. She climbed the narrow servants' stairs to her small, drafty chamber, tucked beneath the eaves. The room was freezing, heated only by a meager grate, but it was hers. She walked to the small dressing table and picked up the silver hand mirror. The glass was cracked straight down the middle, distorting her reflection into fractured pieces. She saw only what Beatrice allowed her to see. Dull brown hair pulled back too tightly, pale skin, a quiet mouth that rarely smiled, an invisible girl, a burden. Setting the mirror face down, she knelt by her narrow bed and reached beneath the floorboards, pulling out a heavy, leather-bound sketchbook. This was her only rebellion. The pages were filled with meticulous, hyper-realistic illustrations of rare flora. While Henrietta collected ribbons, Clara collected the secret architecture of flowers. She knew the Latin names, the precise shape of the petals, the exact conditions required for them to bloom. She turned to a blank page and picked up a piece of charcoal, seeking solace in the rhythmic scratching against the thick paper. She closed her eyes, trying to picture the mythical night-scented orchid, a flower she had read about in her father's old texts but had never seen. It was said to only open in total darkness, releasing an intoxicating, unforgettable fragrance. It was a creature of the shadows, much like herself. A sharp knock at her door broke her concentration. Clara hid the book and opened the door. It was Thomas, one of the kitchen boys, looking out of breath. He thrust a crumpled, unmarked envelope toward her. "Came to the back entrance," Thomas muttered, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Delivery boy said it was for the quiet miss. Cook told me to throw it out, but I figured you might want it." "Thank you, Thomas," Clara whispered, her brow furrowing in confusion. She closed the door and held the heavy parchment envelope. It bore no crest, no wax seal, no direction. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the flap. Inside was a single, thick piece of vellum. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was a sketch. Rendered in masterful, confident strokes of graphite, it depicted a flower with elegantly curling petals and a deep, shadowed center. She recognized it instantly, though she had only ever imagined it. A night-scented orchid. In the bottom corner, barely visible, were 3 small, sharp letters. Ah! Someone had sent this to her. Someone who knew of her secret passion. Someone outside the oppressive walls of Vance Manor had seen her, recognized her, and reached out. A tremor of something foreign and terrifying fluttered in Clara's chest. It felt dangerously like hope. She carefully slipped the sketch between the pages of her own leather-bound book, hiding it away in the dark. Below, the carriage wheels crunched against the gravel drive, signaling the departure for the spring assembly. Clara stood up, smoothed her faded gray gown, and prepared to step into the ballroom as a ghost, entirely unaware that the man who drew the orchid was waiting for her. The spring assembly was a suffocating theater of silk, candlelight, and predatory ambition. The air in the grand hall was thick with the scent of hot wax, expensive French perfumes, and the desperate sweat of mothers trying to secure fortunes for their daughters. For Clara, the noise was a physical weight. She stood exactly where she had been ordered, half hidden behind a massive fluted marble pillar near the draughty terrace doors, a faded grey smudge against the glittering backdrop of the tun. She held Henrietta's spare fan, a small beaded reticule, and a vial of smelling salts, her arms aching from the stillness. Every few dances, Henrietta would sweep to the edge of the floor, breathless and flushed, demanding Clara fix a loose curl or adjust a slipping ribbon, only to dart back into the light without a word of thanks. Hundreds of people brushed past Clara's pillar. Not a single pair of eyes registered her existence. She was performing her role perfectly. She was invisible. Yet, beneath her quiet exterior, Clara's heart maintained a frantic, irregular rhythm. Against her ribs, hidden in the secret pocket of her mended gown, lay the folded piece of vellum, the night-scented orchid. She had spent the carriage ride turning the letter over in her mind. Who could have sent it? Who knew she existed, let alone understood the precise architecture of the one flower she dreamed of? A sudden, rippling hush fell over the ballroom. It did not happen all at once. The silence started at the grand double doors and spread like a wave across the polished floor, silencing the string quartet mid-measure. The laughter died. The frantic fluttering of fans ceased. Clara leaned forward slightly, peering around the cold edge of the marble. Julian Thorne, the Duke of Athelstone, had arrived. He did not walk into the room so much as he claimed it. He was a tall, severe man, dressed entirely in stark, immaculately tailored black evening clothes that made the brightly colored coats of the other gentlemen look garish and foolish. There was a hard, angular grace to him, a profound stillness that demanded absolute attention. But it was his eyes that commanded the room, a pale, icy gray that swept over the assembled aristocracy with undisguised boredom and deep, weary cynicism. The whispers ignited instantly. The Ice Duke, untouchable, a fortune that could buy half of London. Like a flock of starving birds, the society matrons descended. Lady Beatrice was among the first, dragging a beaming Henrietta by the wrist, pushing her through the crowd to form a blockade in the Duke's path. Clara watched from the shadows, her stomach twisting. This was the world as it was meant to be. Men of power and women of ambition, trading beauty for status. Julian stopped. He did not bow. He barely inclined his head as the matrons offered up their daughters. His face remained an impenetrable mask of aristocratic frost. He answered their frantic, sycophantic chatter with single, clipped syllables, his posture rigid, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. But as Lady Beatrice practically shoved Henrietta into his line of sight, Julian did something unexpected. He looked away. His pale eyes cut right through the glittering center of the room. He ignored the diamonds, the silk, the forced, breathless laughter. He scanned the edges of the hall. He looked past the dowagers, past the footmen, his gaze moving with deliberate, predatory focus toward the darkest corners of the room. And then he stopped. Across the expanse of the crowded ballroom, through a narrow gap in the swirling dancers, Julian Thorne's eyes locked entirely onto Clara. The air rushed out of her lungs. Clara's first instinct was to obey years of conditioning. Hide, shrink, look down. She took a half-step backward, seeking the total shadow of the pillar. But the Duke's gaze was a physical force, pinning her in place. He did not look away. He did not blink. The noise of the ballroom faded into a dull, rushing hum in her ears. Time seemed to stretch, pulling taut like a wire between them. In his pale eyes, Clara saw no dismissal, no aristocratic disdain. Instead, she saw a shocking, violent intensity. It was the look of a man who had been searching a barren landscape for years and had finally found water. He tilted his head, just a fraction. A question. A recognition. Clara's breath hitched. Her hand flew to her chest, pressing against the hidden pocket where the sketch lay. The Duke's estate was Athelstone, the letter A, the legendary, guarded glasshouses. The man who possessed the wealth and the obsession to cultivate a night-scented orchid was standing across the room, staring at her as if she were the only living, breathing creature in the hall. He had not come for the debutantes. He had come to see if the girl from the shadows was real. Julian took a step forward, breaking the circle of matrons. He was moving toward her. Panic, sharp and cold, pierced Clara's chest. He never will notice you. If he crossed the room, if he spoke to her, Beatrice would destroy her. She would be thrown onto the streets by morning. Clara shook her head, a tiny, imperceptible, desperate plea. Please, do not look at me. Do not see me. Julian stopped dead. He read the raw terror in her face. His jaw clenched, a muscle feathering furiously in his cheek. He understood. Before he could change his direction, Lady Beatrice, frustrated by his distraction, tracked his line of sight. Seeing that the Duke was looking toward the drafty pillars, she moved swiftly, intercepting him near the edge of the dance floor, just a few feet from where Clara was hiding. Beatrice was accompanied by Lady Minton, the most vicious gossip in the county. "Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with artificial honey, deliberately positioning herself between Julian and the pillar. "I see you observing the architecture. The hall is quite ancient, though somewhat poorly maintained in the corners." Julian looked down at Beatrice, his expression hardening into something terrifyingly cold. He said nothing. Nervous under his lethal silence, Beatrice let out a high, strained laugh and gestured vaguely toward the shadow behind her. "Pay no mind to the gloom, Your Grace. That is merely my late husband's ward. A charity case, I'm afraid. Utterly invisible, as you can see. She lacks the refinement for society, so I keep her out of pity. One must do one's Christian duty for the unfortunate, even if they are entirely without consequence." Clara closed her eyes, pressing her back flat against the freezing marble. The words sliced through her, reopening the familiar, bleeding wound of her own worthlessness. She braced herself for the sound of the Duke's retreating footsteps, for the inevitable confirmation that she was exactly what Beatrice said she was. Nothing. Julian did not retreat. He stood perfectly still. Clara opened her eyes just enough to see his hands. The heavy white kid leather of his evening gloves stretched and groaned as his fists clenched with such violent force that his knuckles turned white. The temperature around them seemed to plummet. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it possessed a quiet, deadly resonance that made Lady Minton physically flinch. "Lady Beatrice," Julian said, his tone devoid of all warmth, soft and dangerous as a drawn blade. "Your vision is extraordinarily limited." Beatrice blinked, her smile faltering. Your Grace?" Julian did not elaborate. He looked past Beatrice's shoulder, his pale eyes finding Clara one last time. In that fleeting second, the coldness vanished from his face, replaced by a fierce, silent promise that made Clara's heart stop entirely. Then, without another word, without bowing to the hostess or acknowledging the stunned aristocracy around him, the Duke of Athelstone turned on his heel. He strode toward the grand double doors, signaling his footman with a sharp flick of his wrist. The doors closed behind him with a heavy, final thud. The ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers. Lady Beatrice stood frozen, her face flushed with a mixture of confusion and outrage. "The Ice Duke," she spat, trying to recover her dignity for Lady Minton's sake. "An unbearable, arrogant man. We are well rid of him tonight." Behind the pillar, Clara's knees gave way. She slid down the cold marble, her hands trembling violently as she clutched the spare fan to her chest. She was completely hidden once again, but the safety of the shadows was gone. The invisible walls of her prison had been breached. She pressed her hand over the hidden vellum sketch, her pulse hammering against her palm. He had seen her, and he was furious. For 3 days, the silence in Vance Manor was heavier than stone. The glittering chaos of the spring assembly had faded into a tense, suffocating normalcy. Lady Beatrice had spent the intervening hours ruthlessly scrubbing the Duke of Athelstone's abrupt departure from the county's collective memory. According to the letters she dictated to her friends, His Grace had merely suffered a sudden bout of the ague. He was a fragile man, despite his imposing stature, she insisted, and his departure had nothing to do with any lack of interest in Henrietta. Clara had retreated back into the woodwork. She mended hems, polished the silver hand mirror that sat cracked on her dresser, and moved through the corridors with her practiced, breathless silence. Yet, something fundamental had fractured within her. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the terrifying physical weight of Julian Thorne's pale eyes, pinning her to the marble pillar. She felt the heat of his unspoken fury on her behalf. She would trace the charcoal lines of the night-scented orchid hidden in her sketchbook, terrified that she had imagined the entire encounter, terrified that she had invented the salvation in his gaze. By the dawn of the 4th day, the cold November fog had settled thickly over the estate. Clara was awake before the scullery maids, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands wrapped tightly around her shawl. Then, the floorboards began to vibrate. It was a low, steady rumble, completely unlike the quick, light crunch of the butcher's cart or the milk wagon. This was the deep, rhythmic thunder of heavy draft horses and massive, iron-banded wheels. It shook the glass in Clara's small window. Frowning, Clara stood and pushed the latch open, leaning out into the biting morning air. Through the thick, swirling mist of the gravel drive, a convoy was materializing. Not one carriage, but 6 massive transport wagons, painted in deep, lacquered green. The lead wagon was pulled by 4 massive black percherons, their breath pluming in the freezing air. On the side of every wagon, etched in gleaming gold leaf, was the imposing crest of the Duke of Athelstone. Clara's breath hitched, her fingers gripping the icy wooden sill. The wagons came to a halt in front of the manor's grand portico, forming a barricade of polished wood and iron. Before the dust could even settle, 24 men in immaculate dark green livery swung down from the benches. They moved with military precision. They did not knock on the servants' entrance. They did not wait for an invitation. The heavy oak front doors of Vance Manor were thrown open from the inside by a bewildered footman. By now, the noise had woken the entire house. Footsteps pounded in the corridors below. Clara heard the sharp, furious voice of Lady Beatrice echoing up the stairwell. Without thinking, abandoning her usual instinct to hide, Clara hurried out of her room and moved to the edge of the grand staircase, peering down into the foyer. Lady Beatrice stood at the bottom of the stairs, clutching a velvet dressing gown around her rigid frame. Henrietta was hovering behind her, her hair in curlers, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and greedy anticipation. A solidly built man, with iron-gray hair and an immaculate wool coat, stepped across the threshold. He did not remove his hat immediately. He carried a heavy leather ledger under one arm and an air of absolute, unbothered authority. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill with indignation. "You are tearing up my gravel. Who authorized this circus at such an hour?" The man finally removed his hat, revealing a stern, weathered face. "Mr. Harwood, my lady, head botanist and estate manager for His Grace, the Duke of Athelstone." Henrietta gasped, clutching her mother's arm. "Mother, it's him. The Duke has sent a gesture. I told you he was overcome." Beatrice's posture instantly shifted from outrage to supreme, vindicated arrogance. She smoothed the front of her dressing gown, lifting her chin to look down her nose at the estate manager. "I see. Well, Mr. Harwood, while His Grace's methods are brutally unrefined, I suppose an apology of this scale is necessary after his disgraceful exit at the assembly. You may instruct your men to bring whatever trinkets he has sent into the drawing room. My daughter will inspect them after she is properly dressed." Mr. Harwood did not blink. He looked at Lady Beatrice with the same cold, assessing detachment his master possessed. "You misunderstand, my lady," Harwood said, his voice carrying effortlessly up the grand staircase. "I have no instructions regarding your daughter, and these are not trinkets." He turned his head and snapped his fingers sharply toward the open doors. "Bring them in. Mind the temperature transitions." What happened next shattered the oppressive gloom of Vance Manor forever. The men in green livery began to march through the front doors, carrying massive, brass-bound planters and thick glass cloches. But it was not jewelry, nor was it silk. It was life. They brought in towering emerald-green ferns that swept against the dreary wallpaper. They carried trellises dripping with heavy, star-shaped jasmine, the sweet, heady perfume instantly cutting through the smell of dust and floor wax. They brought armfuls of midnight blue roses, their velvet petals defying the winter chill. Dozens of men flowed into the house, placing the breathtaking, exotic flora on every available surface, on the mahogany sideboards, lining the grand staircase, banking against the cold marble fireplace. The bleak, lifeless foyer was being aggressively, relentlessly swallowed by a vibrant, breathing jungle of impossible beauty. "Stop this at once!" Beatrice shrieked, panic finally cracking her voice as a footman set a massive, blooming orchid directly onto her prized entrance table. "What is the meaning of this? If these are not for Henrietta, then who?" "They are for Miss Clara Vance," Harwood announced, his voice ringing out like a judge's gavel. The entire foyer went dead silent. The servants, gathered at the edges of the room, turned their heads in shock. Lady Beatrice physically staggered backward, her face draining of all color, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Henrietta let out a sharp, offended noise, her hands flying to her face. "That is impossible," Beatrice whispered, the words trembling with a sudden, suffocating terror. She is nothing. There has been a mistake." "The Duke of Athelstone does not make mistakes, madam," Harwood replied coldly. Slowly, Harwood looked up. His eyes found Clara, standing on the landing halfway up the stairs. She was still wearing her faded grey dress, her hair loose over her shoulders, but she was no longer pressing herself into the shadows. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she felt it in her throat. Harwood bowed deeply, a gesture of profound, undeniable respect that no one in that house had ever offered her. "Miss Vance," Harwood called up to her, "His Grace sends his deepest regards, and begs your forgiveness for the delay. The glass houses required careful harvesting." Clara descended the stairs. She did not look at her stepmother, who was trembling with a rage so profound it bordered on apoplexy. She did not look at her stunned stepsister. She looked only at the sea of incredible, vibrant life that had conquered the house. The men parted for her as she reached the bottom step. Harwood stepped forward, carrying a single delicate glass cloche. Inside, resting in a bed of dark moss, was a flower unlike any other. Its petals were an elegant, twisting white, bruised with deep violet at the throat. The night-scented orchid, the living embodiment of her secret sketch. Clara reached out, her hands shaking, and lifted the glass dome. The scent that rose from it was intoxicating, a rich, deep fragrance that spoke of midnight and quiet strength. Nestled against the moss, beside the delicate roots of the flower, lay a small, thick piece of vellum, folded once. Clara picked it up. She could feel the heat of her stepmother's furious gaze burning into the side of her face, but for the first time in her life, the fear was gone. It had been completely eradicated by the overwhelming, undeniable proof that she existed, that she mattered, that she was seen. She unfolded the heavy paper. The handwriting was sharp, aggressive, and black as iron. "There are no shadows left to hide you." Julian, Clara closed her eyes, clutching the note to her chest. The oppressive, invisible cage of Vance Manor had not just been unlocked. Julian Thorne had torn it down from the outside, filling the ruins with breathtaking light. By midday, Vance Manor smelled like a shattered perfume bottle. The heady, intoxicating fragrance of jasmine, crushed velvet roses, and dark earth permeated every floorboard and curtain. For the first time in a decade, the gloomy estate felt terrifyingly alive. In the upstairs corridors, Lady Beatrice's composure finally snapped. Her voice echoed off the plaster as she shrieked orders at the household staff, demanding they throw the wretched weeds into the fire. But the servants, who had spent years walking on eggshells around their mistress, suddenly found themselves moving with deliberate, uncharacteristic slowness. Mr. Harwood had made it entirely clear whom the Flora belonged to. No footman earning £10 a year was going to risk the wrath of the Duke of Athelstone by burning his property. Furious and finding her authority suddenly hollow, Beatrice stormed up the narrow servants' stairs and threw open the door to Clara's room. Clara was standing by her small window, still clutching the glass cloche that housed the night-scented orchid.
"You scheming, manipulative little viper," Beatrice hissed, slamming the door behind her. Her chest heaved, her eyes wide with a frantic, cornered malice.
"You think you have won. You think a few cartloads of foliage change what you are. He is mocking you, Clara. The Duke is playing a cruel, eccentric game to humiliate me, and he is using you as the punchline." Clara did not shrink back. The words, which would have crushed her only a week ago, suddenly felt thin. They lacked their usual weight. She looked at her stepmother, noting the tremor in the older woman's hands. "He is not mocking me," Clara said, her voice quiet, but remarkably steady. Beatrice stepped forward, her hand raising as if to strike the glass cloche from Clara's grip. "I will have you out on the streets by nightfall. You will pack whatever rags you own, and you will leave this house. Let us see how much His Grace cares for a beggar shivering in the London fog." Before Beatrice could advance another step, heavy, unhurried footsteps sounded on the wooden stairs outside the room, the stairs that were strictly forbidden to guests. The door, which Beatrice had slammed shut, was pushed open with a slow, deliberate force. Julian Thorne stood in the doorway. He was not dressed for a ballroom. He wore riding leathers, a heavy dark wool coat, and boots dusted with the chalky earth of the country roads. Without the stark formality of his evening clothes, the sheer, imposing size of him was even more evident. He filled the narrow doorway, his presence sucking the air from the small, freezing room. Beatrice staggered backward, her face draining of blood. "Your Grace, you cannot be here. This is the servants' wing. It is utterly improper." Julian did not even look at her. His pale eyes bypassed Beatrice completely, locking onto Clara. He took in her faded dress, the bare walls, the miserable grate with its cold ashes, and finally, the cracked silver mirror lying face down on the dressing table. A muscle leaped in his jaw. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Lady Beatrice," Julian said softly, his voice devoid of inflection, "you will leave this room." "I most certainly will not," Beatrice stammered, trying to summon her aristocratic outrage. "She is my ward, and you are trespassing in my—" Julian slowly turned his head to look at her. The sheer, glacial fury in his gaze made the words die in Beatrice's throat. "If you are still standing in this room in 3 seconds," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "I will ensure that not a single bank in England extends you credit, and every door in society is permanently barred to your name. Leave." Beatrice opened her mouth, closed it, and fled. her heavy silk skirts rustling frantically as she stumbled down the stairs. Silence fell over the small chamber. Julian stood perfectly still near the doorway, as if stepping any further into her meager space would frighten her. He looked at the night-scented orchid in her hands, and then up to her eyes. The terrifying, cold mask he wore for the world dissolved entirely, leaving a man who looked unexpectedly weary, yet profoundly relieved. "I apologize for the aggression of my methods," Julian said quietly, the harshness gone from his voice. "I knew that if I sent a single bouquet, she would throw it away. I had to send a forest so she could not hide it from you." Clara swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the glass dome. "Why?" she whispered, the question breaking from her chest. "Why are you doing this, Your Grace? The ton says you do not notice anyone." Julian took a slow step into the room. "The ton says many things, Miss Vance. Most of them are violently wrong." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window. "I noticed you in late September. It was raining." Clara blinked, entirely bewildered. "September? You were in the ruined glass house at the edge of the estate. The one your stepmother let rot," Julian explained, his voice softening. "I was riding the property line. I saw you through the broken glass. You were kneeling in the mud, carefully splinting the stem of a dying climbing fern with a piece of twine and a stick. You stayed there for an hour in the freezing rain, just to ensure it would hold." He looked back at her, his pale eyes intensely vulnerable. "I have lived my entire life surrounded by people who destroy beautiful things for sport, people who measure worth by titles and ledgers. And there you were, completely unseen, saving something simply because it deserved to live." Clara felt a hot, unfamiliar stinging in her eyes. He had seen her, not the polished, artificial version of a debutante, but her truest self, in the mud and the rain. "The sketch," Clara breathed. "You drew it." "I did," Julian admitted, a faint, self-deprecating smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I am no artist, but my glass houses are my sanctuary. I study the things that require patience. The night-scented orchid does not bloom for an audience. It blooms in the dark. It is resilient, and it is extraordinary. When I drew it, I was thinking of you." The walls Clara had built around her heart, the walls of invisibility, of making herself small, began to tremble. She looked at this formidable man, this terrifying duke, who bent society to his will, and realized that beneath his armor of ice, he was just as lonely as she was. He was asking her to see him, just as profoundly as he had seen her. Clara set the glass cloche down gently on the windowsill. She walked past the cracked silver hand mirror, ignoring it completely. She knelt by her bed, reached beneath the loose floorboard, and pulled out her heavy, leather-bound sketchbook. She stood and walked toward him. She did not lower her eyes. She stopped just inches from him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his wool coat, close enough to smell the crisp scent of winter air and pine clinging to him. Her hands trembling slightly, she offered him the book. Julian looked at the worn leather cover, then at her face. He understood exactly what she was giving him. It was not just paper. It was the map of her soul, the proof of her existence that she had hidden from the world. He took off his leather riding glove. Slowly, gently, he took the book from her hands. As he did, his bare fingers brushed against hers. The contact was electric, sending a warm, terrifying shock straight to her chest. Julian did not pull away. He let his thumb rest against her knuckles for a long, heavy moment. He opened the book. He turned the pages slowly, his eyes absorbing the meticulous, brilliant illustrations of ferns, roses, and climbing vines. When he reached the page where she had tucked his sketch of the orchid alongside her own drawing, he stopped. "They are magnificent, Clara," he murmured, speaking her given name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer in his mouth. "You are magnificent." "I am terrified," Clara whispered, the honest confession slipping out before she could stop it. If I step into the light with you, they will look at me. They will tear me apart. She will ensure it. Julian closed the book carefully and looked down at her, his expression hardening into absolute, unwavering resolve. He reached out, his bare hand gently cupping her jaw. His touch was incredibly warm, anchoring her to the ground. "Let them look," Julian said, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Let them try to tear you down. I have spent my life building a fortress of ice, Clara. I will gladly use it to crush anyone who dares to speak a word against you." He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. "You never have to hide again. Will you let me prove it?" Clara looked into his pale eyes, the fear melting away under the overwhelming heat of his devotion. She took a deep breath, stepping fully out of the shadows, and nodded. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the carriages began to arrive. The gossip had torn through the county faster than a wildfire. Rumors of a dozen wagons bearing the Athelstone crest, of Vance Manor being swallowed by exotic jungles, had proven too delicious to ignore. Lady Minton, accompanied by 3 of the most influential dowagers in the district, arrived under the thin pretext of checking on Lady Beatrice's health, their eyes sharp and hungry for disaster. The grand drawing room was a chaotic spectacle. The sheer volume of midnight blue roses, towering ferns, and star-shaped jasmine made the oppressive room feel like a vibrant, untamed greenhouse. Beatrice, pale and teetering on the edge of utter ruin, had hastily assembled a desperate defense. She sat stiffly on the velvet settee, a cup of untouched tea rattling in its saucer, as Lady Minton surveyed the room through her lorgnette. "It is quite the display, Beatrice," Lady Minton said, her voice dripping with venomous curiosity. "Though I must confess, the note attached to the doorframe was most peculiar. For Miss Clara Vance. Has the Duke suffered a complete break with reality?" Beatrice let out a high, brittle laugh. "A misunderstanding, Eleanor. A tragic, humiliating misunderstanding. His Grace meant these for Henrietta, of course. But Clara, my late husband's ward, is a deeply troubled girl. She has always harbored delusions of grandeur. She intercepted the estate manager this morning and claimed the delivery was for her. I am afraid the girl is entirely unhinged." "How dreadful," one of the dowagers murmured, though her eyes gleamed with delight. "Indeed," Beatrice said, her voice hardening. "I have sent for her. She will explain her deceit to you all, and then I am washing my hands of her. She leaves my house today." The heavy mahogany doors opened. Clara stepped into the drawing room. She was still wearing her faded grey dress, carrying nothing but her leather-bound sketchbook. But as she crossed the Aubusson rug, something fundamental had changed. She did not hug the edges of the room. She did not make her footsteps silent. She walked directly to the center of the floor, her shoulders pinned back, her chin held level. The cracked silver mirror of her past had been left behind on her dresser, abandoned to the dust. Beatrice stood up, pointing a trembling finger at her. "There she is, the thief of my daughter's reputation. Tell them, Clara, tell Lady Minton, how you intercepted His Grace's gesture. Confess your pathetic lies, so that polite society may know exactly what you are." The room plunged into an expectant, suffocating silence. The matrons leaned forward, waiting for the mousy, invisible girl to collapse into tears and apologies. Clara looked at the women who had ignored her existence for a decade. She looked at Beatrice, whose face was twisted in an ugly mask of desperation. The old fear flared in Clara's chest, a conditioned reflex, but it found no purchase. Julian had seen her in the rain. He had seen her worth. She did not need to make herself small ever again. "No, my lady," Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it was remarkably clear, carrying effortlessly across the quiet room. "I will not confess to a lie to protect your pride." Beatrice choked, stepping forward. "How dare you?" "The flowers were not sent to Henrietta," Clara continued, her tone steady, laced with a quiet, unshakable dignity. They were sent to me, because the Duke of Athelstone saw me. He noticed me, Lady Beatrice, despite every effort you made to convince me I was invisible. You arrogant little wretch, Beatrice shrieked, entirely losing her aristocratic veneer. She raised her hand, stepping swiftly toward Clara. I will strike the insolence right out of your mouth. If you raise your hand to her, Lady Beatrice, it will be the last movement you ever make in polite society. The voice cut through the room like the crack of a whip. Lady Minton gasped, dropping her lorgnette. The dowagers froze in their chairs. Julian Thorne stepped out from the shadowed alcove of the adjoining library. He had been waiting. He walked slowly into the drawing room, his imposing frame commanding the space so completely that the very air seemed to bow to him. He came to stand directly beside Clara, his presence a lethal, impenetrable shield. He did not look at the matrons. His pale, terrifying eyes were fixed entirely on Beatrice, who had frozen mid-step, her hand still raised in the air. "Put your hand down," Julian commanded softly. Beatrice's arm dropped to her side as if the strings had been cut. She was trembling so violently that the silk of her gown rustled against the floor. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did not know. I thought you had departed." "I was merely waiting for Miss Vance to gather her belongings," Julian said smoothly, though his jaw was locked in fury. He reached out, taking Clara's hand in his. He interlaced their fingers publicly, firmly, right in front of the most vicious gossips in the county. Clara's breath hitched, but she held on tight, her thumb pressing against his pulse. Julian finally turned his gaze to the audience of stunned aristocrats. "Let there be no misunderstandings," Julian announced, his voice ringing with absolute, crushing authority. "I did not send these blooms to Henrietta Vance. I sent them to the only woman in this house who possesses any grace, intellect, or worth. I sent them to Clara." He looked back at Beatrice, delivering the final, devastating blow. "You told her I would never notice her. You were wrong. I noticed nothing else. And I will spend the rest of my life ensuring the world notices her as the Duchess of Athelstone." Lady Minton let out a strangled squeak. Beatrice collapsed onto the settee, her face buried in her hands, her social empire reduced to ash in a matter of seconds. There would be no recovering from this. The Ice Duke had spoken, and he had publicly branded her a cruel, irrelevant liar. Julian looked down at Clara. The icy rage in his face melted, replaced by a warmth so profound it made Clara's heart ache. He offered her his arm. "Are you ready to leave this place, Clara?" he asked softly, speaking only to her. Clara looked around the room one last time. She saw the shadows where she used to hide, the pillars she used to cower behind. They held no power over her anymore. She slipped her arm through his, holding her sketchbook tight against her side. "Yes," she said, a brilliant, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "Take me home, Julian." They walked out of the drawing room together. They did not rush. They moved with the quiet, unhurried grace of two people who had conquered their fears and found their equals. As they stepped out the front doors of Vance Manor and into the crisp, bright afternoon air, Clara did not look back at the cage she had escaped. She looked only at the man beside her, stepping freely, completely, and undeniably into the light. 6 months later, the private glass houses of Athelstone Park were bathed in the soft, silver glow of a full moon. The heavy glass panes kept the spring chill at bay, trapping the warm, humid air and the overwhelming fragrance of 1,000 exotic blooms. Clara sat on a wrought-iron bench at the center of the conservatory, a fresh sheet of vellum spread across her lap. She was no longer dressed in faded gray, but in a sweeping gown of deep emerald silk. Beside her, Julian sat in comfortable silence, his arm resting casually along the back of the bench behind her, his fingers gently playing with a loose curl of her hair. He leaned forward, watching as her charcoal pencil deftly traced the elegant, twisting petals of a new bloom they had cultivated together. The Ice Duke was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes held nothing but unguarded warmth. Clara paused her drawing, looking up to meet his gaze. In the quiet, fragrant dark, surrounded by the beautiful things they had saved, there were no shadows left to hide in, only the breathtaking certainty of being completely, unconditionally seen. And so, Clara left the shadows behind forever, blooming in the brilliant light of an unwavering love. If this story captured your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable romances. I would love to know in the comments, what was your favorite moment of this tale? Thank you so much for your wonderful company. Here is to the kind of love that truly sees us. Until our next story, goodbye.